Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. It started on an ordinary morning, one that felt no different from any other. People were rushing to work, complaining about the weather, arguing over the smallest things, just like any other day. The hum of city life echoed across the streets, the world moving on without a care. But then, without warning, the sky was torn apart. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. It was as if the air itself had split open, revealing something huge and dark, a gash in the very fabric of the world. And then the ships came. They weren't like anything anyone had seen before, huge, black, and ominous, with a hum that rattled your bones. It was a noise so deep, so unnatural, that it seemed to come from the very core of the earth itself. People stared up in disbelief, not knowing whether it was some sort of government experiment gone horribly wrong or just a strange atmospheric event. But deep down, they all felt it. Something was wrong. It wasn't until the first city went silent that people started to panic. No, it wasn't a power outage or a simple glitch. The lights didn't flicker, they were snuffed out, like someone had erased the city from existence. One moment, New York was there, bustling as always. The next, gone. And then it happened to Tokyo and Paris, whole cities, wiped clean off the map, as though they had never existed at all. People couldn't believe it at first. Surely this was some kind of mistake, right? Maybe it was a massive misunderstanding. But when more cities started to fall, and nothing anyone did could stop it, the truth hit hard. They weren't here to talk. They weren't here to negotiate. The invaders weren't interested in explaining themselves. They were here to conquer, to destroy. Governments scrambled, sending missiles, launching jets, doing everything they could to fight back. But nothing worked. The ships were too advanced. The missiles didn't even get close before they were shot down. The fighter jets didn't make it past the outer perimeter. No matter what they tried, the aliens were always one step ahead. The world felt it, an overwhelming sense of helplessness. It was as though Earth was a helpless insect, and the invaders were the giant boot that hovered overhead, waiting to stomp it out. Fear spread like wildfire. Hope began to fade. And yet, somewhere deep inside humanity, there was a spark that refused to be extinguished. In the small, forgotten town of Montana, while the world burned, one man refused to back down. His name was Marcus Lane, and he was a retired engineer, once responsible for designing top-secret military weapons. Weapons that no one had ever dared to use. Weapons so dangerous that most governments had buried them, hoping they would never see the light of day. But Marcus knew better. When the alien ships came, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't call for help. Instead, he went to his basement, pulled out his old tools, and began working. It took him 3 days. 3 days of sweat, frustration, and cursing. All the while, the world outside was falling apart, cities vanishing one after another, lives being lost by the billions. The invaders showed no mercy, no signs of slowing down. But Marcus? He wasn't done yet. What he built didn't look like much at first. A rusty satellite dish, bolted to the back of an old pickup truck. It was the kind of thing that most people would have overlooked, dismissed as some scrap metal, a pointless project for an old man. But when Marcus powered it up, the sky itself seemed to tremble. With one shot, one pulse of energy, an alien warship, one of the massive invaders, simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris, just nothing. It was gone. The invaders froze. For the first time, they hesitated. The invaders hovered in the sky, their massive ships now suspended in confusion. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The world, broken and battered, seemed to hold its breath. Marcus, standing on the worn porch of his small house, watched as the alien warship dissolved into nothingness. His heart was racing, his body aching from exhaustion, but he didn't let himself stop to rest. The alien ship had vanished, but so much was still left to do. The world had been given a brief, flickering hope, but it wasn't over. The invaders hadn't left for good. They weren't retreating out of fear. Marcus knew this was just a pause in their plans, a momentary lapse in their seemingly unstoppable assault. He had shaken them, but he hadn't beaten them. Not yet. Still, Marcus had done something no one had thought possible. A single shot, one quick move, and the mightiest force humanity had ever seen had been forced to retreat. It was a small victory, yes, but it was enough to give Earth something it had been desperately lacking: hope. The alien ships, once bearing down with terrifying certainty, had retreated back into the tear in the sky, disappearing without a trace. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world was left with a rare moment of peace. That's when Marcus made his move. He didn't wait for the military or the governments to take control. He didn't wait for orders or instructions. He had done his part, and he wasn't about to let anyone take credit for the weapon he had just created. Or worse, lock it away in some underground vault. Marcus knew that this weapon, this mysterious device of his, was the key to Earth's survival. If it worked once, it could work again. But only if it remained in the right hands. He grabbed the old CB radio, his fingers still shaking, and broadcasted a message. His voice, ragged and raw from the 3 days of intense work, crackled over the static. "Earth to the invaders," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "You think you can just come here and wipe us out? You've underestimated us. Attack again and face total annihilation." He didn't know if they could hear him, but he knew he had to say it. It wasn't just for the invaders. It wasn't even just for the survivors still hiding in the ashes of their fallen cities. It was for himself, for the strength he needed to keep going. They had given him a reason to fight, but even more, they had shown him how much more they could do if they were willing to stand up. For what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire world were waiting for the invaders to respond. Would they retaliate? Would they simply fire again, wiping Earth off the map like it was nothing more than a piece of debris? The fear crept back in, slow and cold. But then, something unexpected happened. The ships didn't fire. They didn't retaliate. They didn't attack again. Instead, they turned. Without any sound, without any warning, the invaders' fleet withdrew into the dark rift in the sky. The tier sealed behind them, leaving only blue skies in its wake. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant sounds of survivors, still reeling from the shock, but beginning to step out from their hiding places. It wasn't victory. Not yet. Not by a long shot. But it was the first sign that humanity had shown the universe something it hadn't seen before: defiance. Earth had not been a victim. Earth had fought back. And for the first time since the invasion began, people felt like they had a chance. But as the world began to breathe again, Marcus knew the truth. The invaders hadn't left forever. They'd been forced to retreat, yes, but that retreat wasn't the end. He'd bought the Earth time to prepare, time to make them understand that humanity was not a species to be wiped out. But time was a luxury they didn't have much of. Marcus could feel it in his gut, like a distant thunderstorm on the horizon. The invaders would return. And when they did, they would be smarter, stronger, and far more dangerous. The world's leaders, those still standing after the initial attack, began to flood into Montana, desperate to find out what Marcus had done and how they could replicate it. Black-suited men arrived in helicopters, some wearing mirrored sunglasses, others sporting military uniforms with insignias that Marcus didn't recognize. They descended on the small town like vultures circling a carcass, pushing through crowds of survivors, demanding answers. At first, they came with promises of protection, with gratitude. But as the days wore on, their tone changed. They began to speak of global security, of taking control, of confiscating Marcus's weapon for the greater good. Marcus, however, was not easily swayed. He wasn't interested in working with governments that had done nothing but watch as cities crumbled. He wasn't interested in bureaucratic red tape or in handing over the device that had saved humanity's life. "Think you can scare me?" Marcus asked one day, sitting on the crumbling porch of his house, the weight of the shotgun resting lazily across his lap. "I've stared down the end of the world. You're just ants screaming at the boot." His words didn't change the situation. The governments made their move in the dead of night. Black helicopters descended and masked soldiers stormed the town, their weapons drawn. They were there to take the device by force. There were no promises now. No more sweet words. Just a cold, calculated move to claim what Marcus had built. What they didn't expect was that the entire town, every man, woman, and child, was ready. It wasn't just Marcus who had fought back. The entire town had been watching, had been surviving. They'd seen the alien ships. They'd lost everything. And they weren't going to let anyone, human or alien, take it from them. When the soldiers arrived, it wasn't just Marcus standing there, his shotgun in hand. It was the entire town, armed with whatever they could get their hands on. Hunting rifles, shotguns, even homemade Molotov cocktails. They were prepared to fight, to defend the last piece of hope they had left. The soldiers hesitated. They had expected easy compliance. What they got instead was a town that wasn't afraid to die, a town that was prepared to defend its future, no matter the cost. A gunshot rang out. The soldiers panicked, and chaos erupted. The invaders might have been able to wipe out cities with no resistance, but humanity would fight back with everything it had. Marcus stood at the center of it all, his eyes scanning the chaos, his mind racing. This wasn't a battle they'd prepared for. The governments might have thought they could control the situation, but the truth was, the power had shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, humanity was fighting for its own survival, and Marcus wasn't about to let anyone take away what he had started. This passage deepens the conflict, showing Marcus's struggle against both the aliens and Earth's own government. The town's uprising is a turning point, emphasizing humanity's defiance. The tension builds, setting the stage for the larger battle that is yet to come. The story leaves room for more developments, and it is left open for the next phase of Marcus's journey. The battle in the small town of Montana raged on, the sound of gunfire and explosions echoing through the once quiet streets. It wasn't just a fight for survival now, it was a declaration to the world and to the aliens that humanity would not be erased. Marcus stood in the thick of it, eyes sharp and unwavering, his body moving almost on instinct. Every sound, every scream, every shot fired was like a beat in the rhythm of a battle that had no real rules, no real structure. It was chaos, but it was also a fight for everything the people had left. The soldiers, once so confident in their mission, now found themselves trapped. The people of the town knew their terrain. They knew the winding streets, the hidden alleyways, the places where a sniper could get the perfect shot. They knew how to fight like cornered animals, and they fought with the rage of those who had already lost everything. Marcus watched as the soldiers scrambled, their carefully constructed plans falling apart in the face of the relentless counterattack. Some of them tried to regroup, signaling to each other, but it was too late. The town had become an unbreakable fortress, its people united by the need to defend their last shred of hope. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't afford to pause. His mind was still focused on the bigger picture. He knew that no matter how fiercely they fought back, no matter how many soldiers they pushed out, the world was still in danger. The alien threat hadn't gone anywhere. It was just waiting, watching, learning. The ship that had vanished into the sky after Marcus's shot was only a small part of a much larger fleet. And the technology that had been used to wipe out entire cities? It wasn't just a weapon of mass destruction. It was a message to Earth, to show that they could be defeated. Despite everything, Marcus couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that their victory over the soldiers wasn't enough. They had stopped the military from taking the device, sure, but they hadn't stopped the aliens. The invaders would return. They would come back smarter, deadlier, and far more prepared. Marcus had no illusions about what this town could do. It was a symbol, yes, but it was also a ticking clock. The moment the governments realized that Marcus' weapon was still intact, they would stop at nothing to get it. The world would come for him, just as the aliens had, just as everyone always came for power. He needed to leave. He needed to go somewhere where he could keep working, building, and preparing for the war that was coming. He had made his stand here, but this town wouldn't be enough. Earth needed a better plan, a larger resistance, and Marcus was the key to making that happen. But just as he was about to turn to leave the chaos behind and head toward his next move, a shout echoed through the streets. "Marcus, over here!" The voice was familiar, cutting through the smoke and dust that filled the air. Marcus turned to see one of the local fighters, Hannah, a former high school teacher who had taken up arms to defend her family, running toward him. She was breathless, covered in dirt, but her eyes were fierce. "They're not done yet, Marcus. They're still coming." Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the edge of panic behind it. Before he could respond, the sound of engines roared in the distance. At first it seemed like a normal vehicle, but it was too loud, too powerful. Then Marcus saw them. Black, armored vehicles, tearing down the road. They weren't from the local military. These weren't human. The next wave had arrived. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The fear he had pushed deep down rushed to the surface. It wasn't the government this time. It was the aliens. The second wave of the invasion had begun. The vehicles stopped at the edge of town, their massive wheels kicking up dirt as they parked in perfect formation. From inside, black armored soldiers began to disembark. The same unnerving, otherworldly silence that had accompanied the first invasion filled the air again. But this time Marcus wasn't shocked. He was ready. And now, so was the town. "Get to the basements!" Marcus shouted, raising his weapon and scanning the area. "Everyone, now!" The townspeople didn't need to be told twice. They had seen what happened to New York, to Paris, to Tokyo. They knew what these invaders could do. They scattered quickly, heading for the underground bunkers they had built in anticipation of this moment. The defenses they had set up over the past few days were primitive, but effective. Homemade traps, makeshift barricades, and old weapons were all they had, but they were going to make it count. Marcus turned to the others, his mind already calculating the next move. He needed to figure out how to turn the tide in their favor, how to make this small town of survivors into something bigger, something capable of standing against an alien force. They needed more than just guerrilla tactics. They needed real power, real weapons. And the only way to get that was to get the world involved. "We fight them here, but the real war is out there," Marcus muttered to himself, his eyes narrowing as he watched the invaders begin to set up their own positions. "We need more." But it wasn't just the alien soldiers Marcus had to worry about. His attention flickered briefly to the horizon, where dark shapes began to emerge. Ships, hundreds of them. The full fleet was on its way. The first wave had been just a testing ground, a reconnaissance. Now the real invasion was here. The scale of it was unlike anything Earth had ever seen. No longer were the invaders scattered, each ship operating on its own. Now they moved as a unit, as a force with a singular purpose. The invaders began their attack almost immediately. They had learned from the first defeat. This time they weren't making the same mistakes. They deployed bioengineered creatures, massive, horrifying beasts, into the streets. The creatures looked like nothing Marcus had ever seen before. They were enormous, with long, serpentine bodies covered in thick, scaled armor. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and their fangs dripped with a venomous fluid that burned through whatever it touched. They moved swiftly, covering ground faster than any human could hope to. Marcus grabbed his rifle, scanning the battlefield. "Hold your positions," he shouted. "Get ready to fire." The resistance opened fire, their plasma rifles cutting through the air. The first wave of bio-creatures fell, their armored bodies crumpling under the pressure of the shots. But it wasn't enough. More creatures surged forward, pushing through the firestorm. As Marcus watched the chaos unfold, his mind raced. If they didn't stop this now, they would never get another chance. The aliens were testing them, pushing them to their limits. But Marcus knew this fight had to be won. Because if they didn't stand their ground here, there would be nothing left to protect when the rest of the world finally caught on. He turned to Hannah, his eyes locked with hers. "Get to the next bunker. Tell them to prepare the electromagnetic cannons. We're going to need everything we've got." Hannah nodded, disappearing into the smoke. Marcus's heart was pounding as he turned back to the advancing invaders. He had no illusions about how this was going to end. It was never going to be easy. It was never going to be simple. But humanity had already shown they could survive. Now it was time to prove they could win. The first round of fire hit the ground near Marcus, sending him diving for cover. His pulse was racing, but there was no time for fear. Not now. He had a job to do. The world was counting on him. This section continues the battle, setting the stage for the escalating invasion. Marcus is forced to confront the reality of the alien threat and begins to make crucial decisions about humanity's next steps. The tension builds, leaving the door open for the next chapter in the story. The ground shook with every step the alien creatures took. Marcus could feel it in his bones, the reverberations of something far too massive for the Earth to handle. But he didn't have time to focus on the fear. There were no luxuries like panic or hesitation in war. There was only action. The creatures advanced, their howls rising in a terrifying chorus, echoing across the town. The few remaining fighters in the town squared off against them, their eyes steely with determination. They knew the stakes. This wasn't just a battle for their homes. It was a battle for the entire planet. The invaders' monstrous creations tore through barricades and shattered buildings in a chaotic surge, their claws scraping against the rubble as they made their way deeper into the heart of the town. "Hold the line," Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the barrage of alien noise. The sound of plasma weapons firing echoed through the air, bright streaks of light cutting through the smoke as the resistance attempted to push the creatures back. But the beasts were relentless. For every creature that fell, 2 more took its place. The resistance had little firepower left, and the aliens seemed to know it. Marcus peered through the smoke, watching as the creatures swarmed around the edges of the barricades, their eyes glowing like cold fire. They were fast. Too fast. The plasma rifles fired again, but it was clear that the defense wasn't holding. The creatures were adapted to this fight. They had learned from the previous encounter, and it showed. Their scales were thick, resistant to anything that wasn't packed with enough power to bring them down in one hit. Marcus turned, scanning the horizon. The ships above, a massive fleet now descending upon Earth like vultures over a dying animal, hovered ominously. They weren't just here to invade. They were here to finish what they had started. The next wave would be impossible to stop without a strategy that went beyond brute force. There had to be a way to outsmart them. His mind raced, each idea shooting past faster than the last. He needed to buy more time. Time to regroup, to get the electromagnetic cannons operational, to gather the forces they still had left. The forces were thin, and their supplies were running low. But there was one thing they had in abundance: rage. The kind of rage that had fueled humanity's survival since the dawn of time. Turning to a nearby fighter, a young man named Ethan who had been handling the communications, Marcus shouted, "Ethan, get to the radio. Tell the others to focus on the creatures. We need to buy time for the cannons to be ready. Keep them distracted." Ethan nodded grimly and bolted in the direction of the command center. Marcus didn't wait. He grabbed the nearest rifle and took position at the barricade, his eyes scanning for the creatures as they picked their way through the devastation. He aimed carefully, breathing in slow, measured breaths. The resistance had enough weapons to make a dent, but they weren't going to stop the invasion. They needed to slow it down, just enough for the cannons to be ready. As the first creature came into view, Marcus squeezed the trigger. The plasma shot tore through the air, striking the creature's shoulder and causing it to stagger. It didn't fall, though. Instead, it roared, a guttural sound that rattled Marcus's bones and charged forward. The ground beneath him cracked as the beast leaped, its claws swiping through the air. Marcus fired again, hitting its chest this time, but it was too late. The creature lunged, sending Marcus sprawling to the ground. His rifle slipped from his grasp, and the world around him went momentarily black as the wind was knocked from his lungs. His head was spinning, but the ground beneath him was cold and hard. He pushed himself up, the pain from his body's impact shooting up his spine. His heart was pounding, his pulse echoing in his ears. The creature stood above him, towering, its jaws snapping open to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. Marcus scrambled for his rifle, but his fingers fumbled. The creature's claws scraped the dirt as it leaned forward, ready to finish him off. In that moment, Marcus knew he was out of time. But then, a burst of fire erupted from behind him. Plasma shots struck the creature's side, sending it reeling back. Marcus twisted his head to see one of the remaining resistance fighters, a woman named Clara, running toward him with her rifle raised. She fired again, her aim true, and the creature howled in pain as it fell backward, blood splattering the dirt. "Get up, Marcus!" Clara yelled, pulling him to his feet. "We don't have much time. The cannons are ready. The others are waiting for you." Marcus didn't need any further encouragement. He grabbed his rifle, nodded at Clara, and ran toward the bunker. The electromagnetic cannons were their last hope. If they couldn't use them effectively, humanity wouldn't stand a chance. The town was just a temporary hold. The real battle was still out there. Inside the bunker, the remaining resistance fighters and technicians were working in a frenzy, preparing the electromagnetic cannons. The air inside was thick with tension, the hum of machinery filling the space as the technicians ran through final checks. A map of the alien fleet was pinned to the wall, with red dots marking the locations of the ships in the sky. The invasion was closing in. Marcus approached the control panel, his hands steady despite the chaos outside. "Are we ready?" he asked, his voice sharp. One of the technicians, a man named Alden, who had been working on the reverse-engineered technology, glanced at Marcus with a weary expression. "Almost. The cannons are operational, but we still need to synchronize them with the defense grid. We can't risk a misfire." Marcus nodded. "Do it. We don't have much time." The technician turned back to the controls, his fingers flying over the keys. Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the devastation that had once been a thriving town. What was left of it was a war zone. The streets were lined with rubble and burned-out husks of vehicles. In the distance, the ships hovered, casting their shadows across the land like a plague descending from the heavens. A cold realization gripped Marcus. This wasn't just about defending Earth anymore. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity wasn't just some insignificant speck of dust. They weren't going to cower, to be erased without a fight. They had something to prove, if not to the invaders, then to the universe itself. Earth was not just a victim. Earth was a force to be reckoned with. As the final adjustments were made to the cannons, the first wave of alien ships began to move toward the surface, their immense size blotting out the sun. The resistance fighters around Marcus shifted nervously, watching the skies, knowing that everything was about to change. "Ready," Alden shouted. "The grid's synced. We're good to go." Marcus took a deep breath, then turned to the group. "This is it. We make our stand here, or we don't make it at all. Prepare to fire when I give the word." The ground trembled as the first alien ship touched down. It wasn't just one. It was a fleet, an entire armada that had descended upon Earth. The cannons hummed with energy, their massive frames aimed at the ships. Marcus stood still for a moment, watching, waiting. This was the moment that would determine whether Earth would stand or fall. They could take down one ship, maybe two, but the entire fleet? The odds were slim. Yet Marcus knew that if they didn't fight with everything they had, it would be over before it had even begun. The scene builds toward the decisive moment, where the electromagnetic cannons are the last line of defense for humanity. The tension rises as Marcus prepares for the battle, knowing the stakes are higher than ever. This keeps the door open for the next chapter, where the true clash between Earth and the alien invaders will unfold. The sky overhead darkened as the alien fleet descended like a storm, their massive ships blocking out the sun. The town, which had been an oasis of defiance, now felt small and fragile against the monstrous scale of the invasion. Marcus could feel the pulse of his own heartbeat in his chest as the seconds stretched out, each one dragging with the weight of what was about to happen. He glanced over at the technicians and resistance fighters who had gathered around the control panel. Their faces were grim, their hands shaking, but none of them faltered. They were ready to fight. The largest of the alien ships, a black leviathan that hovered above the town like a vengeful god, slowly descended toward the ground. It was so massive that its shadow spread over the entire battlefield, sending a chill down Marcus's spine. This was the moment, no more second chances. If they didn't act now, they'd never get another opportunity. The electromagnetic cannons hummed, their energy building, as if they too understood the magnitude of the fight. Marcus gave a sharp nod to Alden, who was manning the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons, his face tense with concentration. "We've got one shot at this," Marcus said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "When I say fire, you hit them with everything. No hesitation." Alden didn't need any more explanation. The technician's eyes locked onto the screen in front of him, watching as the alien ships began to deploy their forces. Small pods detached from the large ships, their metallic surfaces glinting in the sunlight, and began descending toward the ground. Soldiers, thousands of them, dropped from the sky in armored suits, landing with a deafening thud that shook the earth beneath their feet. Marcus could see them now, dark, hulking figures, their movements precise and coordinated, like a well-trained military unit. They were ready for war. "Targets locked," Alden called out. "Ready to fire on your mark." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the flagship exploded. not in a burst of flames but in a series of catastrophic sparks and energy surges. The ship flickered and faltered, its shields collapsing under the assault. The massive hull cracked, sending jagged pieces of metal flying in every direction. The aliens had underestimated the power of their own weapon, and for the first time, they were feeling the weight of their arrogance. The flagship began to crumble, its lights flickering out as it plummeted toward the ground. Marcus couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. They had done it. The flagship was gone, shattered in a blaze of electromagnetic fury. But there was no time to savor the victory. As the flagship began to crash, the rest of the alien fleet reacted. The smaller ships, those that had remained in the sky, waiting for their chance, began to scatter. They weren't retreating, they were repositioning, and soon they would retaliate. The resistance fighters wasted no time. They opened fire on the advancing alien soldiers, their plasma rifles humming as they shot blast after blast into the alien ranks. The soldiers, though armored and far stronger than any human, were not invincible. But they were relentless, advancing even as they took casualties. The ground seemed to shake with each explosion as the alien forces pushed forward, determined to reclaim their fallen flagship. "Prepare for another wave!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the battle. "Fall back to the secondary positions. We can't hold them here for long." The resistance fighters quickly began to fall back, moving with military precision despite the chaos around them. The cannons had bought them some time, but now they needed to regroup and prepare for the next wave. Marcus turned to Alden, his face grim. "Can we fire again?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Alden's fingers flew over the controls, but his expression faltered. "I don't know. We've only got enough power for one more shot, if that. The grid wasn't designed to take that much energy in one go." Marcus cursed under his breath. They needed to be ready for whatever came next. The aliens were coming in waves now, but their technology was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Every tactic they'd used so far had been based on human ingenuity and desperation. They were running out of both. A loud, screeching noise cut through the air, and Marcus looked up to see another alien ship descending. This one was different. It was larger, its hull gleaming a deep, foreboding shade of red. The air seemed to crackle with energy as it descended slowly toward the ground, its massive engines cutting through the air with a deafening roar. It wasn't just a ship. It was a war machine, designed to destroy everything in its path. "They're bringing in their heavy artillery," Alden said, his voice trembling. "We can't stop that thing with the weapons we have." Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed on the descending craft, his mind racing. The situation was spiraling out of control. The aliens were learning. They were adapting. And Earth was still fighting like it had something to prove. "Get ready," Marcus ordered. "We're not done yet. They want to see how far they can push us? Fine. Let's show them what happens when you underestimate humanity." The tension continues to rise as Marcus and the Resistance brace for the final onslaught. With the alien forces adapting and countering, the fate of the battle hangs in the balance. This leaves the story open for further escalation, and the next chapter of humanity's struggle to survive and fight back. The massive red warship descended with a terrifying grace, its engines roaring like thunder. Its sheer size blocked out what little light remained, casting a shadow that stretched for miles. The ground trembled beneath Marcus' boots as the warship touched down, its landing gears screeching against the Earth's surface. The air crackled with energy, as though the ship itself was charged with an invisible force. It hovered just above the ground, its massive hull rippling with a dark, foreboding energy. Marcus knew what this was. This wasn't just another ship. It wasn't just another wave. This was the alien commander's personal vessel, a ship designed for annihilation. There was no mistaking it. The vessel's weapons alone could level entire cities. And worse, the soldiers they deployed were unlike anything the Resistance had faced before. This ship was bringing the full force of the alien military down to Earth. "Everyone fall back!" Marcus shouted over the chaos, his voice cutting through the sound of gunfire and explosions. The Resistance fighters, battered and exhausted, scrambled to comply, retreating to the secondary positions Marcus had ordered. They were no longer fighting for territory. They were fighting for survival. Behind him, the electromagnetic cannons had already been powered down, their energy reserves almost drained from the first strike. The remaining techs worked frantically to reload and calibrate the weapons, but there was little hope they could fire another shot before the aliens closed in. "Damn it," Marcus muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the battlefield. They were running out of time, running out of options. The alien forces were moving fast, pushing forward relentlessly. The soldiers advanced in tight, disciplined formations, their armored suits glinting in the dim light. They were no longer just a threat. They were a force that was prepared to crush humanity's resistance once and for all. Marcus turned to the remaining fighters who had fallen back with him, their faces grim, bloodied, but resolute. "Hold your ground. This is the final stand. We don't let them take another inch." It was clear that their tactics, hit and run, guerrilla warfare, had worked to a point. They had managed to inflict damage, but it was only temporary. The aliens were adapting, learning how humanity fought, how they thought. They were evolving at a speed that seemed to outpace the Earth's ability to resist. But Marcus wasn't done. He couldn't afford to be. He knew this was the last chance for humanity to prove it had the will to survive. The Red Warship began to deploy its forces. Hundreds of alien soldiers poured out from the ship, marching in perfect formation. They were massive, far larger than any human soldier. Their armor was sleek and terrifying, designed not just for protection, but for sheer intimidation. And then there were the creatures, monstrous bioengineered horrors that scuttled along the ground like oversized spiders, their many eyes glowing in the dim light. They had evolved beyond the first wave of beasts the aliens had sent to Earth. These creatures were faster, stronger, and far deadlier. Marcus didn't hesitate. He barked orders, directing the Resistance fighters to take cover behind barricades and structures that had been hastily assembled over the past few days. "Do not engage unless you have a clear shot. We need to conserve ammo." The creatures advanced, their monstrous legs clicking against the pavement, their mouths dripping with venomous saliva. They moved with eerie precision, scuttling like hunting machines, their eyes scanning every corner of the battlefield. The alien soldiers, meanwhile, were preparing for the assault, forming ranks and leveling their weapons. It was clear they weren't just here to fight. They were here to wipe humanity off the map. The first wave of fire from the aliens came without warning. The ground exploded in front of Marcus as plasma rounds slammed into the barricades. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the Resistance's positions. People screamed as they were thrown to the ground, their weapons knocked from their hands. The remaining fighters scrambled to regroup, but the alien assault was too powerful, too relentless. It was clear that the Resistance wasn't equipped to handle this level of force. Marcus pushed forward, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. His mind raced, calculating their next move. There was no time for hesitation. The longer they waited, the more time the aliens had to close in. He looked toward the distant horizon, where the rest of the alien fleet hovered just out of reach. The ships weren't just waiting. They were preparing to finish what they had started. And Marcus knew that they wouldn't be able to hold out much longer if they couldn't find a way to push back. "Clara!" Marcus shouted, spotting the young woman in the chaos. She was crouched behind a pile of rubble, firing her rifle at an approaching alien soldier. "We need to move. The electromagnetic cannons aren't going to hold them off for long. We need to find another way." Clara didn't respond immediately, her focus fixed on her target. She fired another round, taking down one of the alien soldiers, but it was clear that she was running out of ammo. She glanced at Marcus, her expression hard. "I know. But what other options do we have?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. Marcus scanned the battlefield again. He saw the alien warship, still hovering above them, ominous and powerful, and the alien soldiers pushing forward. The resistance fighters were barely holding their own. Every few seconds, another soldier fell. There was no way to defeat the alien forces with what they had left. They were too few, and their weapons were running out of energy. The cannons weren't ready. The narrative now dives deeper into Marcus's high-risk plan to hijack the alien warship, setting up an intense sequence of events that will determine the next phase of the battle. This keeps the story open for further exploration and action, laying the groundwork for future twists and challenges. Marcus and Clara wasted no time. The chaos around them was their only ally. The alien forces were relentless, pushing the resistance back inch by inch. They knew they were running out of time, but there was no turning back now. "All right, we'll take the north route," Marcus said, pointing to a narrow alleyway between two burning buildings. "It'll give us some cover as we move toward the ship. The rest of you, keep the aliens busy. Make it look like we're still fighting here." Clara nodded, gripping her rifle tightly. "What's the plan once we get to the ship?" "We get inside. I'll figure out the rest once we're there," Marcus replied, his voice firm. He knew it was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had left. They moved quickly, slipping through the wreckage, dodging alien soldiers as they scurried between the broken buildings. Each step felt like it could be their last, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. Every moment they spent hiding was another moment the invaders were closing in on the rest of the resistance. The sound of alien plasma blasts filled the air as they reached the edge of the warship's landing zone. The massive red ship loomed ahead, a mountain of dark metal, its engines still humming with power. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with energy, and Marcus could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as they neared. The alien ship was both a symbol of their impending defeat and now their last hope. They reached the base of the ship, its towering hull blocking out the sky. There were no guards at the entrance, just the cold, foreboding silence of an enemy vessel that had already conquered so much. Marcus's heart raced as he glanced over at Clara. Her face was set in grim determination, but he could see the fear in her eyes. They both knew what was at stake. Marcus approached the ship's outer wall, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with a device he had rigged together in the chaos of the battle. The device was crude, something Marcus had cobbled together with scraps of alien tech and his own engineering knowledge. It was supposed to hack into the ship's systems and give them access to the controls. But nothing was certain. They had no idea what they were up against once they got inside. "It's now or never," Marcus muttered under his breath, placing the device against the ship's hull. He pressed a button, holding his breath as the device whirred to life. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint blue light flickered across the ship's surface, followed by a low mechanical hum. The hull trembled slightly, and a hidden door slid open with a hiss. Marcus and Clara exchanged a quick glance before slipping inside. The interior of the ship was a labyrinth of metal corridors and dark, alien technology. The air was thick with the strange, sterile scent of the invaders' craft, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was like stepping into the belly of a giant beast, alien, alive, and cold. Marcus's mind raced as he moved quickly, guiding Clara through the narrow hallways. "We need to find the command center," he said, his voice low. "Once we get control of their weapons systems, we can turn them against the fleet. That's our only shot." The ship was eerily quiet, its corridors empty of soldiers, as though it was waiting for something. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was no time to waste. They had to keep moving, no matter how uncertain the situation felt. They reached a large chamber at the center of the ship, a command room filled with strange alien consoles and interfaces. The walls were lined with glowing panels, and in the center of the room stood a massive control station, its interface bathed in an eerie green light. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the console, his mind already working through the complicated alien systems. "Clara, cover me. I need a few minutes to access the main controls." Clara nodded and took position near the door, her rifle at the ready. Marcus connected the device he had rigged to the ship's console, his fingers flying over the unfamiliar alien interface. The symbols on the screen were indecipherable, but Marcus had learned to read the language of the invaders during the early days of the invasion. He used his knowledge of the alien tech to begin the process of overriding the ship's systems. It took every ounce of focus he had, his mind working in overdrive as the ship's AI attempted to reject the intrusion. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought against the invasive security protocols, his heart racing as he inched closer to success. Every second felt like an eternity. The alien soldiers were no doubt searching for them by now. "Come on, come on," Marcus muttered under his breath. Finally, the interface flickered. The green light turned to a steady blue, and a hum of power surged through the room. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ship's weapons systems were now under their control. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew this was only one part of the plan. The real test would be turning the tide of the battle outside. "Let's move," Marcus said, grabbing Clara by the arm and pulling her toward the door. "We've got to get back to the Resistance and launch a full-scale counterattack. It's our only chance." They retraced their steps through the ship, but as they neared the exit, they were met with a surprise. The alien soldiers had finally caught up with them. They stood in the hallway, blocking the path. Marcus and Clara froze for a split second, knowing there was no escape. The soldiers' eyes glowed through their helmets, their weapons raised and aimed directly at them. The air was thick with tension. Then, just as the soldiers prepared to open fire, there was a deafening roar outside. The ground shook, and the walls of the ship seemed to shudder with the impact. The Resistance had launched their counterattack, and Marcus knew what that meant. The electromagnetic cannons had been fired, and the alien forces were now engaged in the fight of their lives. The alien soldiers turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. Marcus seized the opportunity. He grabbed a piece of alien tech from the ship's console and threw it toward the nearest soldier, triggering a burst of energy that sent the creature sprawling to the ground. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired her plasma rifle, taking down the other soldiers in rapid succession. They were outnumbered, but they fought like they had nothing left to lose. Their survival depended on it. As the alien soldiers fell, Marcus and Clara dashed out of the ship, back into the battlefield. The Resistance fighters were holding their ground, their weapons firing in unison as they took down the alien forces. The battle outside was fierce, but now, with control of the ship's weapons, the tide had turned. Marcus took a deep breath, watching the alien fleet in the distance. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the invasion began, Marcus felt something he hadn't dared to believe for so long. Hope. "Let them come," he muttered, his voice grim but resolute. "We're ready." The story concludes with Marcus and Clara successfully gaining control of the alien ship and turning the tide of the battle. With the Resistance now armed with alien technology, humanity has a fighting chance. But with the war far from over, the story leaves open the possibility for future battles and challenges as Earth prepares to defend itself against the next wave of invaders.